Hello, I'm Don Brown. I'm Associate Professor of Environmental Ethics, Science, and Law. This 16-minute presentation will review why it's practically important to understand that climate change is a civilization-challenging ethical and moral issue. A lot of people know that climate change raises moral and ethical issues, but very few people in our experience understand why this is such of practical, concrete importance. In the next slide, we see that the first reason why climate change must be understood as an ethical issue. We're going to review three reasons. The first reason is because climate change is a problem where people in one part of the world, such as the United States, are causing and putting at risk victims in other parts of the world, such as Africa. Some people are putting others at risk who have done little, both in other places and at other times in the future. The next slide shows that the second reason why we must understand climate change as an ethical issue is that the harms to the victims are not mere inconveniences, they are potentially catastrophic: floods, drought, disease, vector-borne disease, and so on. Next slide is one example of catastrophic impacts that are starting to unfold. This slide shows the great rivers of Asia. Most of them that we see here are glacier-fed. If the glaciers disappear, the rivers dry up. The rivers are necessary for drinking water, water supplies, and agriculture. The harms to the victims are not mere inconveniences. They are potentially catastrophic. The next slide shows another group of people whose harms are catastrophic. There are many small island developing states all around the world where tens of thousands of people live who are extraordinarily vulnerable to sea level rise. A lot of these you see in this are in the Southern Pacific. There are quite a few nations that there are tens of thousands of people whose very civilization is hanging in the balance if sea level rises more than a few feet. Another example is Africa in the next slide. You see frequency of drought in the left and mortality in the right. The darker the red, the higher the death threat is. You can see the sub-Sahara Africa, the Sahel region of Africa. People living there are extraordinarily vulnerable to climate change, as well as the Horn of Africa and other parts of Africa. So the third reason why climate change must be understood as an ethical problem stems from the fact that the victims, visualized here by the small red circle on the right of the globe, can't petition their governments to protect them. They must hope that the rich, high-emitting countries, including but not limited to the United States, must, that their sense of justice, their sense of fairness will empower them, will encourage them to protect the vulnerable. The victims can't petition their governments. They must hope, their only hope is that a sense of ethics and justice motivate the high-emitting countries. And so we've seen that there are three reasons why climate change must be understood as an ethical problem. Repeating, some people are putting others at risk. Two, the harms are potentially catastrophic. And third, the victims must rely upon a sense of justice to motivate those causing the problem. And now in the next slide, we turn to an examination of what do we mean by ethics? When we say it's an ethical claim, what do we mean? Well, ethics is the domain of inquiry that examines claims that given certain facts, something is right or wrong, obligatory, or when responsibility attaches to human behavior. Ethics is already in the climate debate, but it's hidden in scientific and economic arguments, people saying that we should not do anything, or implicitly making an ethical claim, but the ethical basis for their claim, or the ethical problem with their claim, is often hidden in scientific and economic arguments. This slide also shows that there are different ethical positions and different bases for ethical positions, religion, ethical theories, shown here on the bottom left-hand side of this slide. Because there are different ethical theories, spotting the ethical issues may not necessarily lead to agreement as to what ethics requires. It could lead to conflict between ethical theories. It could lead, in the bottom right-hand side, to agreement as to what ethics requires. Or more importantly, and this is why it's practically important, we may not agree what ethics requires, but there may be widespread agreement that positions taken are unjust or unethical or unsupported ethically, even though we may disagree as to what perfect justice requires. In the next slide, we see that there is actually a surprising number of climate change issues about which different ethical systems agree what ethics requires, despite different starting points as to where ethics comes from. And the reason for that of an overlapping consensus between ethical theories are listed here. Most religions and most civilizations have variations of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Do no harm. Most cultures agree that it is wrong for some people to hurt other people, that we have duties, responsibilities, and obligations to other people to limit harm to them. Yet climate change action is a problem where some people are allowing themselves to continue to harm others. Most cultures make dangerous behavior criminal. And so the use of scientific uncertainty after the science passes some sort of threshold amount of understanding about the risk of climate change, it is wrong, even if there's still some remaining uncertainty, to use scientific uncertainty as an excuse. And the final things on this chart is that there's a whole series of agreements already in international hard and soft law about what ethically responsible national behavior is. There's human rights law, which is relevant to climate change. There's something called the polluter pays principle. There's something called the no harm principle. There's a whole series of ethical principles that have already been agreed to that should be binding on nations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, including the fact that scientific uncertainty should not be as an excuse anymore. And so, for many climate change ethical issues, there actually is an agreement as to what ethics requires. But it's not necessary, as shown in the next slide, to agree what ethics requires to make progress, because even on issues about which different ethical theories would reach different conclusions as to what is required of nations, it's still possible to spot positions taken by governments that no ethical system would condone. Ethical issue spotting is practically important because it eliminates dubious ethical positions, which are often hidden in scientific and economic arguments, by subjecting those claims to ethical review. And we find over and over again that no ethical system would condone these issues, even though we may disagree as to what ethics requires. This chart shows you a monkey, several monkeys. There's some evidence that even monkeys can spot injustice. Little kids can spot injustice. So injustice is actually quite easy to spot in climate change issues. And so the next slide shows that one of the practical importances of spotting the ethical and moral issues stems from the fact that there may be cross-cultural agreement on many of the positions in climate change, that some of the positions taken are deeply ethically problematic, even though there may be disagreement about what ethics requires. So the practical significance of ethics issue spotting is to help weed out positions of which there are many, many by governments that no ethical system would condone. In the next slide, we see some of the ethical issues, and there are many different civilization challenging ethical issues that are listed in this chart. there's not one ethical issues, but there's a series of different ethical issues, and they raise different kinds of ethical questions. So what we want to do is turn up the volume on these ethical questions. One of the issues is, for instance, what is everyone's obligation in the world to stabilize greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at safe levels? How do we allocate responsibilities ethically? And this whole list of different ethical issues which climate ethics deals with in detail in other places. Just giving you an example of how one of these may play out, the greenhouse gas stabilization issue level, what level of greenhouse gases should every nation try to achieve jointly, working cooperatively with other nations? What is the concentration, in other words, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that should be everyone's goal? This is a huge civilization challenging ethical question, but yet governments take position on this issue as if they can consider their own self-interest, as if they have no ethical obligations, duties, or responsibilities to other people. There's some uncertainty scientifically about what that number should be, but there's a whole series of strong ethical claims you can make about the atmospheric stabilization level. This next chart shows you, in fact, how difficult it will be to stabilize greenhouse gases. The blue line in the upper box shows you what it would take to stabilize at 450 parts per million. The top black line is business as usual, and the bottom box shows you that we're running out of time. Yet, most countries do not articulate their position as if it is in response to the ethical obligations to limit greenhouse gases. This chart shows you that there's a scientific consensus that we need to try to limit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to levels that will prevent a 2-degree warming, because there's a lot of really rapid, really nasty, nonlinear climate surprises out there whose probability increases above 2 degrees centigrade. And so each nation must take a position on the greenhouse gas stabilization level in light of the science. These are, again, some of the issues in climate change, and each one of them raises different ethical issues. We need to raise the volume on the ethical dimensions of climate change. We need to celebrate ethical champions. We need to expose ethical problems with positions of governments. We need to encourage the press to see the ethical issues. We need to force governments to state expressly and explicitly what is their position on these ethical issues. And in conclusion, climate change is a civilization-challenging ethical problem. There are different ethical issues raised by climate change. Most of the ethical issues are hidden in economic and science. Ethical issue spotting is practically needed. We need to work collectively to turn up the volume on the ethical dimensions of climate change. Thank you for your attention. You can reach me at dab57@psu.edu.